Thank you everyone for being here. Late afternoon, evening. Thank you for being here and making the time to be part of this conversation, a very important conversation. My name is Melody Brown-Berkins. I'm the director of the Institute of Arctic Studies in the Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. We've convened this event at a moment when the Arctic is experiencing an extraordinary convergence of pressures and attention, accelerating climate change, renewed geopolitical interest, intensifying security rhetoric, and critically, persistent misunderstandings about Arctic sovereignty and the rights of Arctic indigenous peoples. Recent public statements by US political leaders about Greenland have brought many of these tensions into sharp relief, raising fundamental questions about whose voices shape Arctic narratives, whose knowledge informs security decisions, and whose sovereignty is recognized and respected. At Dartmouth, the Institute of Arctic Studies has spent more than 3 decades working at precisely this intersection. It was founded over 35 years ago to support rigorous, policy-relevant scholarship in the Arctic and Antarctic as well, to build long-term, trusted partnerships across the circumpolar north with communities, governments, and indigenous peoples. Today, our work spans science diplomacy, indigenous-led and community-engaged research, security and governance, environmental humanities, and student leadership development. Across all of this, we hold a clear commitment. Arctic scholarship and policy must be ethically grounded, inclusive, and responsive to the priorities of Arctic peoples themselves. And that commitment is what brings us together today. This conversation is not about speculation or sensational headlines. It's about the responsibility of national alliances, how institutions think about security in the Arctic, how science and knowledge are produced and used, and how sovereignty, particularly indigenous knowledge and sovereignty, must be foundational rather than peripheral to Arctic engagements. So we're very fortunate to have 3 speakers whose work sits at the very heart of these questions. Each brings a distinctive perspective: indigenous leadership, Earth systems and geopolitical security, and international Arctic science cooperation. All also share a commitment to respectful, informed, and cooperative Arctic engagement. I'll offer a brief introduction of each right now, but I'll have a little more chance as I start the first question to introduce them and their expertise more fully in my opening questions. And let me note that unfortunately, Dr. Mike Sfraga, the former US Arctic Ambassador at Large, could not make it for a commitment, but he's very excited and will watch the recording. And I'm sure this conversation will continue and he will be back with us soon. So let me give a quick introduction of Dr. Sara Olsvig is zooming in with us. Thank you so much. She is an Inuk leader from Kalaallit Nunaat, or Greenland, and serves as the international chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, representing Inuit across the circumpolar world. Her leadership has been central to advancing Inuit rights, sovereignty, and self-determination in Arctic and global fora. Marisol Maddox is Senior Arctic Fellow in the Institute of Arctic Studies. She is a scholar of Arctic security whose work bridges geopolitical, military, and Earth systems perspectives. She has been deeply engaged in examining how climate change, biodiversity loss, and planetary instability intersect with national security, particularly in the Arctic. And Dr. Matthew Druckenmiller, Arctic Innovation Fellow in the Institute of Arctic Studies, serves as the Vice President of the International Arctic Science Committee and leads the Navigating the New Arctic Community Office. His work focuses on international science cooperation, community-based research, and the co-production of knowledge with Arctic indigenous peoples. So again, we could not have Mike Sfraga today, but again, he will be with us in the future. I'm going to sit down with the folks and start the questioning. And as the Arctic leader who gave us the title of our conversation today, I want to start with Dr. Sara Olsvig. We can actually see her here as well as behind us on the screen. And so, Dr. Olsvig, thank you again for joining us. I believe, are you in Nuuk or are you still traveling?
I'm in Nuuk.
Okay,
yes.
Wonderful. Glad to see you at home. So, Dr. Olsvig, you are an Inuk leader who represents over 180,000 Inuit across the circumpolar north. You have consistently fought for the rights and sovereignty of indigenous people throughout your career in highest level fora, ranging from the Arctic Council to the United Nations. You serve as international chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, and your home is Kalaallit Nunaat, Greenland. Your quote, "There's no such thing as a better colonizer," is a phrase that has resonated globally after recent statements by the US president and government leaders, suggesting that they could buy or take over Greenland. Your quote is incredibly powerful and has, again, centered this conversation. Can you tell us more about how and why this phrasing should define the narrative for the Arctic, from its security and science to recognition of Arctic indigenous peoples' sovereignty?
First of all, thank you so much for the invitation to this important dialogue. It's good to be in the virtual room with good friends, also from America. It is indeed a turbulent time. We have been extra busy over the weekend as well. I came back from Norway, from Sápmi, and the Arctic Frontiers Conference on Thursday, and moved right into meetings with a big Inuit delegation that came from Canada to greet us here as Canada opened its consulate in Nuuk, a policy that was also contributed a contribution to the Arctic policy and strategy of Canada by Inuit to ensure that we have further connectivity and mobility across state borders. As you said, in the Inuit Circumpolar Council, we represent Inuit across the Arctic, from Chukotka, Russia, Alaska, Canada, and here in Galashiq Nunad. And we predate the states. We've been here for time immemorial, as we say, in Galashiq Nunad for approximately 4,500 years. And we have been, for many millennia, semi-nomadic people that moved across our lands, across the waters when the ice settles, following the hunting and seasons, and moving also across what we today know as the state borders. And so when we, for a little more than a year ago, started to see a sort of a increased tensious rhetoric towards Galashiq Nunad from the US president, it immediately became clear to us that some media, both our own media, but also mainstream international media, were bringing a narrative of that it should be better to be Inuk here or there, or that, one colonizer should be better than another. And immediately it was important for us, and in our first statement addressing the situation, I had this saying that there's no such thing as a better colonizer. And it was, of course, first and foremost because of the rhetoric coming out of the US in terms of, in an actually very hurtful way, using the fact that we have been colonized in the narrative that was produced, and also in how I see it against us, literally talking about some of the wrongdoings of Denmark in our colonial history, and using that in sort of a propagandistic way, after the visit of Trump Jr. here in Galashiq Nunad. And so it was important for us to react in that way. And our press release and the press release that we sent out with this quote was a press release that I made sure was produced with full involvement of all our leaders from Chukotka, from Alaska, from Canada, and Galashiq Nunad. So this was truly something we all stood together around saying. And it was also, for me, important to really reiterate that there is no such thing as a better colonizer, because it to me also represents the recognition of the hard work that Inuit leaders across the Arctic have all done within the states, towards the states, in partnerships with the states, to build the self-government arrangements we have today, which are very different across our homelands. But they all have become what they are, not because self-determination was granted to us, but because we as Inuit inherently exercise our self-determination, and we have been pushing for centuries and decades to engage in equal partnerships through diplomatic and dignified dialogues with the states, to today having established, for example, here in Galaslit Nunad, our self-government agreement, which followed the Home Rule Agreement, and by doing so also having the state that colonized us recognize our right of self-determination. So the phrase or the sentence, "there's no such thing as a better colonizer," was sort of a common sense for us to state, more or less because of the rhetoric that we saw coming over from the other side of the water, and as a response that really for us encompasses everything that needs to be said, to that, what we've been seeing now for more than a year. And if we count back to 2019, of course, for now 6.5 years. And therefore it was important for us to also repeat that over the past year. And again now in January 2026, it's been extremely relevant to repeat it once again.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Olsvig, for setting such a clear and powerful foundation around sovereignty and narrative. I'd like to build on that now with our guests, our two guests in the room here, turning to questions of security with you first, Marisol, specifically how we define it and whose knowledge informs it. So your work, Marisol, focuses on both geopolitical security and Earth system security in the Arctic, arguing that planetary boundary transgressions, including climate change and biodiversity loss, left unmitigated, increase and accelerate national security risks around the world. You are also an expert on Arctic military security, traveling with US and NATO delegations to places like Svalbard and Greenland, and giving numerous interviews over the past month as the US rhetoric escalated, questioning Greenland sovereignty and NATO's effectiveness. Can you tell us more about how an Earth system security perspective shapes what responsible national and alliance security could look like, should look like in the Arctic, and why listening and working with Arctic peoples, especially the Greenlandic communities, respecting their sovereignty is foundational to a credible security strategy?
Yeah, so thanks so much for hosting this great event. Sarah, thank you for taking the time to be with us today when you have an extraordinarily busy schedule. So I'm going to zoom us out a little bit, and then I'll get back to the direct Greenland issue, because it is very important to be clear about that. So as Melody mentioned, the gist of what I study is how the threat environment is changing. And it's not just about security, it's also about financial risk, right? Our insurance and reinsurance and our whole financial sector, that, the way that we understand risk is changing. And I think the planetary boundaries framework is the best I've seen to demonstrate that we're dealing with complex interacting systems. The Earth is made up of complex systems. When we think about climate change, it's not just about carbon. And sometimes, there can be tunnel vision on carbon. It's about the fact that the planetary boundaries framework identifies 9 components of the Earth system that evolved in such a way that then humans evolved on Earth, and we have our basic needs met. You can refer to things like, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? You need to have food security and water security and shelter and these basic needs. And then from that basis, you say, I'm going to be an entrepreneur. I'm going to engage in innovation. And that's how you have, prosperity and the evolution of civilization. And that is being challenged as we are the dominant processes that have evolved around our global economy and other ways of interacting with the world have really been able to leverage the incredible abundance and resilience of Earth, right? You have incredible resilience that comes with this web of interconnectivity, so you can do things that are very not sustainable long term, but because there's been so much abundance on Earth, we've had this false perception that somehow this is a way of being that we can continue, and that's just a completely false and dangerous assumption that is now resulting in us being in the polycrisis that we are entering. And I would just point to a few recent developments. In November, it was the first time that a country, and this was Iceland, classified the potential collapse of the AMOC, which is the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, this major oceanic conveyor belt. They actually characterized that potential collapse as a national security threat. That was in November, just a couple months ago. In January, Copernicus data confirmed that we are on track to breach 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2029 or 2030. The Greenland ice sheet, which is over a mile high in certain places, actually contains about 21 feet of global sea level rise. And 1.5 degrees Celsius has been identified through peer-reviewed research to be this critical threshold for the potential of triggering certain tipping points. And so at this point, we will be surpassing that, but the question is, will we keep going in that direction, or will we we'll get our act together and reel things back in? So if we had to create a Defense Department from scratch today, or a whole national security apparatus, it would probably be pretty different. Yes, you have these conventional threats. Right now we have, Russia, waging a horrific land invasion against Ukraine, right? We have China, wanting to become a nuclear peer of the United States. We now have no remaining arms control agreements. We have a very complicated conventional threat environment. And at the same time, we do not have the luxury of not recognizing that environmental change is this really complicating factor that we have to be taking seriously. And that, and this is challenging because there is so much, inertia within complicated bureaucratic structures. But again, this is where, humanity is capable of achieving incredible feats. And so it's really about having this can-do attitude. And I don't believe anything's impossible, but we have to have the guts and the courage and the determination to really take this seriously and find a way out. And I think, here cynicism is one of the greatest hurdles. And really, I think the cynicism piece is important to understand, because that could actually lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Where we say, oh no, there's nothing happening, climate change is a hoax. And we go straight from that to, oh, things are so far gone that it's hopeless, and so we can't do anything about it, so it's not even worth trying, right? That's unacceptable. And that actually risks triggering collapse dynamics, because it reinforces this idea of short-term gain. If people think that, well, I need to make sure that my family is as well positioned as possible to deal with collapse that's coming, and you see these, people like Mark Zuckerberg who are buying compounds, and there's increasingly reporting that shows that the uber wealthy are trying to insulate themselves from the shocks that larger society experiences. And this will only get worse if we continue the way that things are going. And so this is where, getting to the Greenland issue, this is such a fascinating case study, because Greenland is a majority indigenous country that is seeking to become fully independent. It's this really fascinating interplay between Inuit belief systems, which include things like not believing in land ownership. They have ways of thinking that are super interesting and that I think would be very valuable for us all to think through. But they're trying to merge that with this kind of Westphalian system that gives primacy to states, right? And so they are doing things like, seeking to become more independent from Denmark, and so they want to diversify their economy. They're, really thinking through, how do we balance this, right? So they've done things like banned future extraction of oil or gas or uranium, even while that's the biggest hurdle from having full independence, right, becoming less dependent upon the block grant from Denmark, they're still having an incredible level of integrity in the process by which they seek to diversify their economy, which I think is also a lesson for us all. And it's really important to note that the vast majority of biodiversity on Earth, which has suffered immensely, especially over the last 40 years, we've just seen these incredible declines. But the vast majority of biodiversity that still exists on Earth is on lands that are managed by indigenous peoples. And so we have something to learn from these ways of being in the world that are actually conducive with longevity. And so, all of this is to say that, this isn't the 18th or 19th or 20th century where we, again, have the luxury to pretend that it's okay to just pillage the earth and, we don't have the ability to bounce back. We're hitting up against the limits of Earth's systems and the ability of Earth to have that bounce back, right? And so we really, we have to be thinking differently here, and really respect for sovereignty is at the heart of the basic ability to then cooperate on areas of mutual interest and to be able to grapple with this incredibly complicated reality that we all live in and that we will be dealing with for the rest of our lives. And so Greenland has been so clear, Sarah's been so clear, saying like, we're open for business, not for sale, nothing about us without us. It's from the basis of respect for sovereignty that we find areas of mutual interest and pursue those. But we can't do that if we're stuck on, well, do you recognize our sovereignty? Like this is a complete waste of time. We don't have time for it. So, and I would just say, just listen to what the Greenlanders have been saying, because they have been extremely clear.
Thank you. You've highlighted again how deeply intertwined both rapid environmental change and security on all its fronts. We haven't gotten into. We'll talk maybe a little more about military security, how it's dependent. National security is dependent on our understanding environmental change as well. But I will shift now to that environmental change with Dr. Druckenmiller. How is knowledge created, shared, and used in contexts that we, the science, the knowledge that we are creating for, hopefully for policymakers, decision makers? I'll turn to you because you are the Vice President of the International Arctic Science Committee, charged with advancing peaceful international science cooperation. And you are also Director of the Navigating the New Arctic Community Office, an advocate, so that is, and in that role, an advocate for the co-production of knowledge with Arctic indigenous peoples to advance the best, most impactful Arctic scholarship that hopefully also informs decision-making. So your scholarship bridges community-based observations, international science cooperation, and the co-creation of this policy-relevant knowledge for the Arctic and the planet. Do you think the recent work of places like, and we're going to talk about the Arctic Council as an intergovernmental fora with Arctic indigenous peoples and Arctic nations, your own International Arctic Science Committee, and others, do you think the work to ensure more inclusive, community-engaged co-creation of knowledge, so working at this community level, working with diverse knowledge systems, can continue in these challenging times that have just been set up in the conversation? And do you think it is important that this co-created Arctic knowledge informs policy?
Well, thank you, Melody. And it's very nice to be here with my fellow speakers, Sarah and Marisol. And I joined the Dickey Center as the Arctic Innovation Fellow just last month, so it's a real privilege to be here in person, to see all of you and those online as well. You asked about, I ask in the Arctic Council, so just for those who aren't familiar, I'll say a few clarifying words. The International Arctic Science Committee, IASC, which I serve, as you mentioned, the vice president of, is a non-governmental international organization that its mission is to facilitate and promote international collaboration in all areas of Arctic research, in all places where Arctic research is done, and with the countries that implement that research. Currently, IASC has 25 member countries, including all of the Arctic states. And the collaboration that it supports is really underpinned by shared principles, whether they be in terms of supporting data sharing, indigenous data sovereignty, supporting early career researchers, but there's also shared values. And I think the research community that's very broad, again, it's a non-governmental organization, really exemplifies those shared values across boundaries. The Arctic Council, in contrast, is a governmental international organization made up of the 8 Arctic states along with the permanent participants that looks at all types of issues in the Arctic, ranging from search and rescue to sustainable development, environmental protection. And there's a lot of science that underpins the work of the Arctic Council. And so IASC and the Arctic Council are very complementary organizations. IASC, which predates the Arctic Council by about 5 years, has served for many decades as a source of scientific expertise, contributing to the Arctic Council's assessments. And so in this way, they work together. IASC supports collaboration and research. The Arctic Council, I think, is a great place to look where science can and has informed very important international policies. The question that you ask, though, is can the work of IASC ensure that these inclusive research spaces exist in today's environment? I would say that the frameworks for it exist. IASC has its current strategic plan. One of the pillars is to support Indigenous involvement in Arctic science. So the framework exists. That's the same if you look at the process underway now to plan for the next decade of Arctic research through the next International Polar Year. The International Conference for Arctic Research Planning, the ICARP, is a multi-year process. Throughout that, Indigenous leadership and Indigenous participation has been built in. But I would say that the insurance of these inclusive spaces, insurance with an E, is not through the frameworks, but it's through the people involved. I mean, what Sarah said, that it is about Indigenous peoples exercising their self-determination. It's about them exercising their time away from families, their own energies, and sometimes their own financial resources to participate in these types of bodies. When IASC really took a shift about 10 years ago to wanting to increase Indigenous engagement, they created a action group focused on Indigenous engagement, and that was the term being used then. 5 years later in 2023, when some very structural changes were made, we created within IASC a standing committee on Indigenous involvement, recognizing that we are beyond simply engaging, that if we want to support more applied research in the Arctic, supporting the self-determination of Arctic peoples, that the involvement is necessary. And so if we're going to ensure these inclusive spaces, it's about the people. And IASC as an organization, I think, has made considerable progress in bringing people on board. We have an early career fellowship program that has specifically a fellowship for early career Indigenous scholars. And so that has been a feature of IASC annually for the last number of years. But we also have Indigenous scholars serving outside of that particular fellowship as well. We now, as I mentioned, we have the Standing Committee on Indigenous Involvement, which is, I think, in some ways struggling to find its place within the organization, where it's going to contribute, how it's going to feed into long-term planning, but it's there. And the member countries to IASC can appoint representatives. The permanent participants to the Arctic Council can appoint representatives to the Standing Committee. And I mentioned the ICARP process, the International Conference for Arctic Research Planning. That has an Indigenous co-chair. There are 7 teams within that are developing these decadal scale science plans. Across those 7 teams, there is Indigenous scholars participating. 4 of those 7 teams actually have Indigenous scholars as the co-chairs of those teams. So the people are present, and that's really how we'll sustain these spaces. But I think there's still a lot of work to be done. I think we have to continue to acknowledge that there is still a lot of volunteerism. There is a lot of under-supported participation and engagement of Indigenous peoples in these international bodies. And it really is, in part, on the countries themselves to make sure that the scientists that they send, the Indigenous scholars that they support, are well supported. and that we are creating opportunities for Indigenous scholars to participate. We also, you mentioned co-creation or co-production. The quick definition is bringing Indigenous knowledge and Western science together. And it's not about only the outcomes of the research, but doing it from the very start. It's important to recognize that as a methodology, but it's also important as something that's critical for upholding sovereignty of Indigenous peoples. And so as organizations like IASC develop these decadal scale plans, it's really important to recognize the work that's been done by Indigenous peoples. I'll point to the Greenland research strategy that was developed in 2022, or brought out and published in 2022 through 2030. And it's a strategy that is very much oriented towards international collaboration, acknowledging the climate crisis, acknowledging Greenland's role in the climate system. But what it puts forth first is to connect it to the Greenlandic people, their economies, sustainable social development, to ensure that Greenlandic institutions are leading in that research. And so these international platforms really have to uphold these pillars of Indigenous sovereignty and research. And I think IASC is on a good path towards that. The last thing I'll say is that co-production or co-creation is not only about supporting sovereignty, it's also about the process, ensuring that we are actually bringing different knowledges together and doing better science. I think those of us who've worked in this space know that that's true. But I think there's more work to be done to move beyond simply focusing on the process, but to actually do the good science that's needed to inform the policies. And that was kind of your last question, is related to informing that policy. If we're going to support this type of co-created research in the future, it's not only this linear process from science to policy, but it's a loop where if you actually can inform policy, you can do applied research. It's going to enable more funding to support the type of research that we're talking about. And so I think that's an area where IASC is in a good position to lead in partnership with the Arctic Council.
Thank you. So we've just heard that about sovereignty, security, and science as interconnected, interwoven systems. And I want to return back to, I guess, the future, because we were going to talk about what's the future look like, and the question of what responsible Arctic security frameworks, sovereignty frameworks, science frameworks look like. And Sarah, I'd love your perspective to start with. As we work for more peaceful, respectful Arctic engagements, respecting Inuit sovereignty, respecting Arctic Indigenous peoples' sovereignty, what does maybe a security framework look like, and who should be at the table? And this can be the broad security, but what should it look like and who should be at the table? Does it already exist, or does it need to be created?
It exists state by state, I think. And I think that one thing that it's very important to remember is, yes, we are in a time where more and more people cease to talk about the high north low tension. And we're seeing a repetition in some ways of the focus on the Arctic turning towards military presence and deterrence and sort of the capitals outside of the Arctic raising their attention to that. And that is something that we have seen before as Inuit. The big difference between the current situation and, for example, the beginning of the Cold War is that throughout those decades, Arctic governance has changed completely, in the sense that the self-government arrangement that I spoke of before have been established. We see in the Kingdom of Denmark, which of course consists of 3 nations, and by the way, does not exist in some kind of a international legal void. It is based on international law. The recognition of the people of Galatlitunad as a people pursuant to international law is something that has been recognized not just by Denmark, but also by the wider international society. It's based on the UN Charter. It's based on the rights of indigenous peoples as well. So an important sort of communicative task we've been through for the past year has also to point to that. And by saying that, also explaining time and time again that the governance structures of the Arctic have changed fundamentally in comparison to, half a century ago. Or more, like 70 years ago. So in that, it is also important to remember the contributions we've made as Arctic peoples. The defense agreement between the Kingdom of Denmark and the US, for example, first from 1941, then from 1951, was amended in 2004, bringing Galashinunaat Greenland to the table, taking it from a bilateral arrangement between Denmark and the US to being a trilateral arrangement with Greenland at the table. Greenland, ourselves, through the government at the time, pointing to areas for increased cooperation with the US. Again, we saw also additional agreements signed in 2020, where we also saw a clear recognition by the US, not just that the defense agreement, as its title says, is about the defense of Greenland, but recognizing the significance and contribution of Greenland to US homeland security. And that's something the governments, changing governments, the parliamentarians, we as Kalaallit, as Greenlanders, have been extremely aware of in those many years. So we've been aware of the contribution of the basing rights, for example, that the US has here. We've also been acutely aware of the necessity of maintaining a good defense relationship with the US and in which ways we could work with the US to increase the cooperation based on that. So I would like to say that focus on the security and military issues have changed fundamentally since the beginning of the Cold War. And it's no longer possible for states, at least if they want to do it in a legitimate way or in a way that works, basically in practical terms, to just take decisions without the involvement and without the direct participation of Arctic indigenous peoples. We see that in Canada as well, and how Inuit and other indigenous peoples are integrated into the way that the military presence and other kinds of response and preparedness presence is done in the Arctic Canada and in Alaska as well, where the native corporations and in Inuit native corporations especially play a significant role in servicing the military and also providing knowledge about the Arctic for military presence. And so there are those changes in terms of governance structures that the states and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, for example, and other fora where the debate on military presence usually take place have not really figured out how to adapt to. And that we have seen also in the relationship between Galashinunaat and Greenland. And I think also that sort of diffuseness of who controls what is real, because Greenland, through its government, has constantly challenged Denmark in terms of exactly what I'm saying. You know, for example, taking decisions on building new airports that obviously are critical infrastructure, taking decisions on certain minerals to mine or not to mine that also have security implications, taking decisions on our internet connectivity, through cables on the bottom of the water across to Canada and Iceland, which also has security implications. But there's no doubt for us here, and the legislation is also formed in a way that those decisions are taken by the parliament and government of Greenland. And so Denmark has not been able to just say, well, everything that is security and military related, you cannot touch. They have had to engage with Kalaallit and the government, the parliament, Inatsisartut, for the decisions to be taken in a solid and democratic way, recognizing that decisions that we inherently and also through our own parliament and government do take will have implications on security policies, defense policies, and not least foreign policies, which Greenland has also influenced for a much longer time than most people think. So with all that said, that change in the governance structures of the Arctic is something that really poses a big challenge, I think, to the current changes we're seeing. And it needs to be rethought in the sense that how do we actually engage or work on NATO engagement in the Arctic in a way that is responsive and respectful to the self-determination of the peoples of the Arctic? How do we develop further national military presence in a way that is responsive and respectful to indigenous peoples and self-governing nations? Those are issues that still have yet to be solved state by state, but there are processes ongoing around them. And for Galatlinunaat, I think also that exactly those debates might very well have been what created a room for someone to create a doubt about who controls what. But that is a challenge that we have taken as a good challenge on a democratic basis within the Kingdom of Denmark, and that we have seen strengthening of the cooperation on those areas between the government of Denmark and the government of Greenland. I just want to end this part by saying, to me, the biggest security threat to Inuit and Galatlinunaat is still climate change. I do not see that we are in a place where something else have trumped climate change as the biggest security threat. And I think that is something that we really have to keep working on in both a multilateral and global manner. And it worries me deeply that there are Arctic states that are leaving the multilateral institutions through which we address climate change.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was such an important answer. And I will move to my other two, staying forward-looking. Looking at your role, actually, it builds very well on this, to alliances and international relationships in the Arctic, Marisol. You have argued that the U.S. should change course and respectfully invest in long-standing, trusted relationships with NATO allies in the Arctic. You have said that the alliance with Canada, the Nordics, and other European countries are how the United States has remained safe and secure. What advice might you give to this administration and our Congress about how to get back on a path of respectful, strong alliances in the Arctic, and maybe go back to thinking about climate change as well?
Yeah, so I think, first and foremost, it's just so important to really be agnostic about, the threat environment. So, the politicization of environmental change is not conducive to us having a realistic understanding of how the changes that are occurring affect our security. So it's really important to facilitate, that the kind of the essence of the intelligence community, being speak truth to power, right? You have to allow for, nonpartisan, depoliticized assessments to take place and to inform any decisions or conversations that we have. Our allies are like just the most incredible source of strength for the United States, right? So, even from an adaptation perspective, we need to be figuring out how to adapt infrastructure, evolve to meet the reality of the changes that we're seeing, in addition to mitigating the risks that are developing as well. But just to give a few examples, many of our radar sites in the Arctic are threatened by climate change, whether it's the loss of land-fast ice that is allowing greater storm surge to erode coastlines, having permafrost thaw. Actually, ironically, for a Department of Defense assessment to Congress a couple years ago, on our threats to our installations in the Arctic. Pituffik Space Base, which is our base in Greenland, in northwestern Greenland, was the highest ranked in terms of its exposure to climate hazards, specifically permafrost thaw, because it's entirely built on permafrost. And so as you're getting the warming and you're getting rain on the Greenland ice sheet, you're having this melting, you're getting this inundation of water. And these are critical facilities because the port at Pituffik is only accessible by ocean a couple months of the year. So our hangars for being able to transport by air are considered very essential to the mission. We have the 821st Space-Based Division, Space-Based Group out of Pituffik. This is incredibly important for being able to detect and track any types of aerospace incursions coming towards the US, right? So we need to be able to understand if permafrost thaw is going to affect the integrity of our runways and these different sites. Like that's pretty serious. And changing ocean doesn't just matter for the way that it's compromising life in the sea. It also matters because it's affecting, sound wave propagation and has implications for anti-submarine warfare. And this is research that needs to be done where if the U.S. is paying to do this research on its own, we need to kind of distribute the burden, right? And that's where you have the alliance and our ability to cooperate through some of these different structures in NATO. And Europe is really stepping up. I mean, Denmark has invested recently $13.7 billion into new defense assets for Greenland, including F-35s, long-range drones. This is really to represent that as just a couple dog sled teams is like just really baffling, and they don't deserve to be treated that way. If you have if you have a difference of opinion about something, we have such great relationships with our allies that we should be able to bring those issues to them in a respectful manner. And we have dedicated forums for any of these concerns that we have. I just note a couple other ways in which we benefit from the alliance through, learning from our allies about how to operate in the Arctic, to not just survive, but to thrive, and to be able to, if there was some type of incident and we needed to deploy troops, we want to make sure that our service members know how to operate in a condition that's unlike anywhere else on Earth. And we're learning that from training with our allies that have retained that ability. And even, things like with Norway, we were able to deploy a payload from the Department of Defense onto a Norwegian satellite because they're an ally, right? It was a couple years ago. It was the first time we've ever used a non-US satellite for a DoD payload. Things like Ice Pact, which are about catalyzing investment into ice-breaking capacity. That's an agreement with Finland and Canada. We can do that because we're allies. Finland's building icebreakers for us. We trust them to do that because we're allies. So, you hear the language just today from Munich Security Conference talking about how the US is taking a wrecking ball to the rules-based international order, and that our credibility as an ally is just gone. That's problematic on multiple levels, including the fact that President Trump has said he doesn't want nuclear proliferation, but the US having unreliable extended deterrence is not conducive to that, right? So there are certain global dynamics here that are starting to be catalyzed that are incredibly harmful. So I would just say, just be clear-eyed about how much we benefit from the current system. With NORAD, it's the only binational military command in the world that the US shares with Canada. We have this incredibly close relationship This is, to undermine the alliance would just cause so much additional, taxpayer burden for Americans, but also really erode our ability to protect the homeland in a credible way. So I would just say, like dropping the unproductive language, especially anything about Canada as the 51st state, Greenland as, part of the US. These are non-starters. These are clear red lines. And we're not doing America, even from an America first perspective, this is not the way to secure our interests. And so we need to be very clear about that, even without imposing tariffs and without having invaded Greenland, there's already so much damage that has been done because of the loss of trust that we need to stop the harm so that we can actually start repairing and move forward in a productive way.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go switch to the science world for the last question here before I have you all wrap up, but with one quick question for all of you. So looking ahead, Matt, in the scientific realm, I'm going to take you to the 5th International Polar Year, and hopefully you'll explain a little bit of that for the folks here. But these are large-scale science initiatives. So looking at the planning, the IASC is the International Arctic Science Committee, a big part of planning for the next 5th International Polar Year of 2032-33. It's coming, this planning is now at a time when Arctic science, security, and sovereignty are entangled, escalating issues abound. From your perspective, how can the IPY, this International Polar Year, 5th International Polar Year process, help set a tone for a more inclusive, cooperative science that respects Indigenous sovereignty and brings the best knowledge to responsible security and policy decisions in the Arctic and polar regions?
Thanks for the question. Confronting global scale challenges has been a thread across all of the International Polar Years. The first International Polar Year in 1882, 83, happened at a time, obviously, when there was not awareness or recognition of the thousands of years of knowledge that Indigenous peoples possess. It was a time that access to the Arctic was obviously very different. Still, there were 12 countries that came together to participate in the first International Polar Year. The second was at the start of the Great Depression. Very limited resources for science. The third IPY was at the height of the Cold War. The fourth IPY, the last one in 2027, 2028, was really around that time when we were beginning to understand that we're not only facing climate change, but we're really facing a crisis. And that was really what drove, I think, the mobilization during the last IPY. So the IPYs are intended to be an opportunity over 2 years to allow for 2 field seasons in both poles for the international community to invest together in doing research that not one country or not even a handful of countries could do alone. And so this next IPY is coming up in 2032, 33. And to answer your question of what the IPY can do, I think first, and it's already on track for doing this, but maybe not so explicitly, is to recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples, the human rights, recognizing what Sarah had just said, that climate change remains a major threat to peoples across the Arctic. Having that be explicitly a governing principle for IPY, I think is very important. And I think, again, we are on track towards that. We have Indigenous leadership already engaged in the IPY. But thinking about this question, I would put forward 4 different thoughts I have that could be done in lead up or during the IPY. The first is, we talk about co-creating knowledge, co-creating research. I think we often forget that we are also co-creating people, careers, the ways of doing science. The IPY is, especially because it takes a decade to plan for one, that it is such a critical time to engage early career Indigenous scholars, scientists, allow them to interact internationally and to co-create how we address these problems together. It's something that's easy to say, and it's not that hard to do. I mean, the IPY, the last one in 2007, 2008, there was a whole number of international field schools that I think provided such an amazing opportunity for scientists to come together. Some of those involved indigenous participants, but not so many. I see Don Perovich in the room. I participated in a number of IPY field schools that he helped with, and that was transformative to my career 19 years ago or however long it was. So again, recognizing the co-creation of careers together so that scientists, indigenous knowledge holders really shape the future together is really important. The second, if we think about supporting co-production, indigenous-led research, we really have to have processes in place to evaluate and actually track how we're going about that. There are some frameworks out there, but at least in the US and I think in most contexts, they don't exist. So several years from now, after the IPY, looking back, it's really important to understand how many projects actually were indigenous-led. How did the research investment on this large international scale that we expect, how did those dollars actually make it into indigenous communities to either participate in the research, to lead the research, or to see some type of economic benefit from the research? And then we talk about science informing policy. That is what, in my experience, listening to my indigenous colleagues, communities that I work with across Alaska, that's what they want to see. They want to see science help to inform their decisions, help to inform their policies. And we need to do better at completing that connection and telling the stories of it when we do. And tracking that, evaluating that is really important. We also have to have meaningful measures of how we actually are developing research capacity in Arctic communities. And that has to be aligned with, as I was saying earlier, indigenous research strategies, the Greenland strategy, and other strategies that exist from indigenous peoples. They are not only about the research, but they're about how the research is to invest in their communities, to be able to allow the research to build upon itself. So I think having those processes to track advancement is really important. Thirdly, we talk a lot about indigenous data sovereignty. I'd mentioned that IASC as an organization has a data management policy, and that acknowledges indigenous data sovereignty. But I think during the IPY, we really have an opportunity to look at it as a central organizing principle. So not just something to consider or to strive for, but at the core of how we design research when we're working with Arctic communities, research that's led by Arctic communities. It is a way that would transform the process of developing proposals, of writing budgets, of building the research capacity and the infrastructure for research. And so, again, taking indigenous data sovereignty and making it as a central organizing principle for research, I think is something that the IPY has an opportunity to advance. The fourth, and this goes back to your initial question of thinking about IASC and the Arctic Council and how they've worked together. One of the best examples of IASC as an organization informing the Arctic Council and working with the Arctic Council to inform policy was through the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment, which was done as a partnership between the working groups of the Arctic Council, AMAP, the Arctic Monitoring Assessment Program, and CAF. And it was initiated in 2000, and it over multiple years, I think it was published in 2004, as this, at the time, the most comprehensive assessment of Arctic climate impacts. And it informed research strategies that led into the IPY and beyond. And it still stands as one of the best collaborations, 300 scientists, indigenous scholars coming together to actually assess where we're at. I think this next IPY, we need something on the scale of the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment, living up to our recognition of the importance of indigenous-led research, the importance of indigenous knowledge. And I think doing that during the IPY would be an immense opportunity to develop these equitable, inclusive spaces. But it also, I think, will give us an opportunity to think about some of the other major threats that we haven't even mentioned yet today. We've been talking about colonizing in the context of the aggression from our current U.S. president. But I think there's also similar threats in seeing how AI is being implemented, both in research, but also in managing data and information. And we're seeing these massive tech companies developing digital infrastructure that's serving their economic bottom line. And that is a real threat to research. It's a threat to understanding how we are going to develop information that informs policy on the ground and benefits Arctic peoples. And so I think something on the scale of the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment indirectly could be an opportunity to address that challenge. Another is the rise of attention towards geoengineering. I think that is something that really requires a lot of attention. It's already receiving it in lead up to the IPY. And it's an area where we need to uphold our equitable partnerships with Indigenous peoples,
Yep.
especially as we think about geoengineering strategies that are being discussed as taking place within Indigenous territories.
That may be a whole nother panel, and we might put AI on that one too. But putting a pin in that for just a moment, I'm keeping you just a little bit longer. I wanted to have our panelists have one final just a short round, maybe a very short answer, but to reflect on our own institution for just a moment before I open it up for Q&A with all of you. I just wanted to say, you've each spoken from distinct roles: Indigenous leadership, security in our systems, international science cooperation, but all of you share a deep engagement with academic institutions and the responsibilities they carry to think about our next generation, to think about information moving to policymakers. So I'm going to ask all of you, just to end our comments here before Q&A, to ask you, what responsibility do academic institutions, such as Dartmouth, have to ensure that Arctic engagements in scholarship, studying science, geopolitics, trade, health, security, the arts, among so many different disciplines, what kind of responsibility do we have to respect sovereignty and advance ethical, equitable cooperation? What more must we do if we're not doing enough right now? So I'm actually going to let Sarah finish this. I'm going to start with Marisol. I'm sorry if I caught you off guard. What should Dartmouth be doing? What should academic institutions be doing?
Yeah, so this is quite the time to be a student trying to figure out your future. So I think first and foremost, the need to have a lot of empathy for just how complicated this time is so important. So, being able to hold space for students to be able to think through this. And it's not just an incredibly complex intellectual problem set. It's also a deeply human, viscerally human problem set to grapple with. And so being able to kind of hold space for the emotional side of that is really important, because it is painful. Like, learning about these things is painful, but that pain is actually a teacher, right? It's wisdom. It's telling you something's wrong, and so you should listen to that. It's not saying there's something wrong with you. That's a normal part of, unfortunately, dealing with learning about all these issues. Is you encounter really challenging emotions, and that's actually a very important part of how we figure out, like, the wisdom that we draw upon. It's not just what we have in textbooks or what people can tell us about. It's what we deeply feel as living beings on this planet that are connected to life on Earth. And ultimately, it's interesting, because I feel like, in a way, obviously I don't want to be dealing with these issues, but I do feel like there's a kind of hidden gift in here, in that the process of grappling with the way that our dominant systems have evolved to be so out of alignment with human longevity on Earth, and the process of working together to figure out how to shift things to actually realign with a viable future, right? Where kids actually look forward to the future. That is such an incredible it's an incredible work of healing. And so I think that's actually the real gift, if we allow ourselves to do it. It takes courage. It's not easy. But that's where, working together, realizing that you're not alone, just really, working together and being able to figure out how to maneuver is something that I think could give us so many benefits, including addressing things like the epidemic of loneliness and isolation that we are dealing with. I don't think it's really a coincidence that there was just like some articles about research about these like mass killings that are starting to occur from like a nihilist perspective of just lashing out against the world. It's not based off of necessarily an ideology of like, I hate this person because of their skin color or religion. It's just this hatred of humanity. And that is actually, this is something that I think will only get worse if we don't learn that, indigenous peoples provide an incredible example of what it means for humans to actually have a positive role on Earth and that we do belong here. And because I think a lot of there's a part of the pain of struggling with this is this feeling of self-hatred in a way where you feel like humans are just causing such incredible despair on Earth. And that, if you continue that behavior, it is unacceptable. We know enough that this is really unacceptable to keep going. But, if we can really, again, realign our way of being and understand that we are connected, we can actually understand that humans do have a place on this Earth and that can be very positive.
Thank you. Matt, what could Dartmouth and academic institutions do to make the future of the Arctic more peaceful and inclusive?
Well, I think one of the important roles of any university is to be self-reflective of the scientific process, of how we use information, how we use data, how we conceptualize the world. As I was driving here last night, I was listening to a recent episode of the Daily podcast, and it was on how our understanding of Neanderthal have changed dramatically in recent decades. And it really starts by describing how the first half of the last century, how we really developed this understanding about the Neanderthal based on these very few samples that were poorly constructed. And that it developed this whole image, this whole body of science that was just based on a very incomplete, inaccurate view. And in recent decades, with the advance of better DNA research, we're able to reconstruct the DNA of the Neanderthal, and we learned that they are very, very similar to us in a way that we had never understood before. And we spent decades essentially focusing on how different they are. And now we see how similar we are. And it's a really interesting podcast because it gets into just how human nature often is about othering. And one of the things that, to come back to our conversation about co-creation, co-production, working with indigenous peoples, indigenous knowledge, I think, at least in my career, it has really helped self-reflect on how I develop knowledge. And in many cases, it's about how the knowledge I have is that I've grown up with, at least in an academic sense, is not place-based. And I think one of the things that, as we confront the challenges of climate, as we confront how science develops worldviews, it's really an opportunity now to think about place-based knowledge. And I think that's one thread of how, at least in an Arctic context, indigenous peoples are contributing in an extremely important way of focusing on place. And not only what's happening in the environment, but the history of that place, the language of that place, the people of that place. And I think engaging in knowledge in that way allows you to self-reflect and realize that some of the things that you've thought for a very long time, that you've organized your career around, may not be so true. So I'll end there.
Thank you. And Sarah, I'm giving you the last word before we have Q&A from the audience. You're very close to Ilismatasarfik and the universities there, but you work around the world. So thinking about Dartmouth and what you know of us, but in our academic institutions, what could we do better?
Well, I think first of all, it's to have that reflection that we just heard about, also reflect on the broader significance and sort of impact of knowledge production over centuries in colonizing indigenous peoples. The early expeditions and polar explorers, the data that they collected and reported back to the capitals, the whole history around Robert Peary and how he also had a campaign for the US to purchase Greenland already in 1916 after having explored our homelands and competed with other polar explorers to gather that data. So really reflecting over how institutions, researchers, explorers, research as a whole has played a very significant role in colonization and will continue to do so if it does not change its way of acting, of being produced, of being non-reflective of the asymmetrical power relation you will have in between big institutions and our small communities here. I like to use the example of the dog sled. Now Marisol mentioned the dog sleds. I grew up dog sledding, and I always thought it was so funny to think about that, you know, people would want to do snowmobiles instead, because what are you going to do when you run out of fuel? With the dog sled, you can continue forever. And the dog sled and our rimutut, they have skills, specialized skills that came from Inuit and centuries and millennia of Inuit having these dogs, breeding them and teaching them to be sled dogs. And today they have a very significant role in the Danish military presence here, and having, you know, brought that indigenous knowledge into the ability of doing the sovereignty and doing the military presence in the northeastern area of Galashinulat, where you would not have been able to do so with a snowmobile, because you would simply not be able to bring enough fuel. So you know, some of these ways of thinking that might be total blind spots for some are so obvious for us who grew up with it. And so that also brings a worldview that will be invisible for others if they do not open their minds to it. So to me, it's also about the individual researcher and the institutions to educate themselves and making themselves available or able to opening up their minds to understanding the world in different ways like we do. And as Inuit and colonized peoples, you know, we have to speak many languages. We have to understand many different knowledge paradigms. We have to be able to conduct diplomacy as well as governance in a world that is so asymmetric in terms of power. And therefore, to me, it's also a matter of recognizing that sometimes it actually feels like we are more globalized than so many others. And having that recognition in the meeting with someone, and the meeting with someone not being a meeting where you feel as an indigenous person or scholar that the opposite person sort of views you in a sort of a deficit-based approach, as if you were just a passive spectator to your own development, because it is totally contrary to that. Seen from within, as Arctic indigenous peoples, we have shaped our own communities and our own societies, and we have paved our own ways to the international arena. And I think that's something to also recognize in the approach and engagement with us also in knowledge production and research.
Thank you. And I know I've kept you all late, and I've kept Sara very late. It's later in Nuuk. But I would like to see if there's maybe one question, or maybe two, but one question at least before we let our folks go. Oh, do we? Maybe I read my notes wrong. But let me see if folks are okay staying. Do we have a question from the audience? Oh, I see one here and one here. Let me go back there first. Wait for a microphone so we can all hear you.
No, very little has been said about the.
Oh, there's a microphone coming. Just one sec. Behind you. My apologies. And if you want, yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
I've been trying to see if much has been said about the future outlook for the economy, not just of Greenland, but of the Arctic. We know that transportation will change. We know that mining, global climate change is triggering the economic access to the Arctic generally. But you have not talked about it much as how will it change the culture? The world's interest in the Arctic is only increasing dramatically because of the opening that's happening because of climate change.
So the question is, yes, about this is the shipping, this is the mining.
I mean, I just read quickly that the economy of Greenland is dependent on fishing and subsidies from Denmark. That will be an extraordinary cultural change as more opening occurs.
Sarah, did you hear, was that one you would like to take, that question?
Yes, I heard it. Do you want to collect more questions, or should I reply
Yeah,
now?
I'll do one more. I'll do one before we, and it was right here. One more question. Is that okay? You would, okay, microphone's coming.
Yeah, this is for Sarah. Sarah, Donald Trump has said that if the United States does it, the United States has to take over Greenland because if we don't, Russia or China will. Are you concerned that Russia or China are interested in taking over Greenland?
All right, we have two questions. I think I'll let Sarah put those down. And so the first one was about what's the thinking about the changes in economy that are like that you're hearing are coming with climate change, with the changes in Greenland, and the second one is specifically was just said. I'll let you go, Sarah.
To the last question? No.
No, go to the first question.
Oh,
on
that was my
economics.
reply
Sorry,
to the
go
last
ahead.
question. No. No, we don't have military, Russian or Chinese military activities around Greenland. The latest observation of, any such ships, for example, is many, many years old. We have seen what my Danish colleagues call a tactical retreat in terms of Chinese interest in investment in Galashlitnunat, which is also related to the US and Denmark politely in a more sort of quiet way, telling Greenland that we shouldn't, work with Chinese investments that could have significance to any security-related activities. I do want to say also that climate change brings with it extremely unpredictable weather, unpredictable ice conditions. One year you will see an open, seaway, and the other year it's totally closed. Last year here in Nuuk Fjord, our fishers and hunters had difficulty in going out hunting and fishing because the ice was coming out of the fjord in a way that we haven't seen before, and not at all at that time of the year. So a long portion of the spring of last year, the fjord was much more inaccessible than we have seen before. So I think that's an important aspect to remember also when we talk about shipping lanes, that they are not, opening up in a stable way, and do not look to do so for the time being, at least the one that goes through, past Greenland's west coast, the Northwest Passage. I also don't really buy that it should be specifically climate change that provides further access to minerals as such, because most of the mineral deposits we have and the known mineral deposits we have would already be accessible. They are not under the ice. They are along the coast that is ice-free. The question about mineral exploitation is more a global question, whether it is cost-effective, whether there's a good business case, deeply dependent on world market prices. We saw the plans for a big iron ore mine here in the Nuuk Fjord some years ago, Of course, that was the big debate of the politics here for those years, like we saw with the possible uranium mine, resulting in a national compromise of saying we don't want to do uranium mining. So the questions of mining have very often determined the election results, and that might not have reached, international mainstream media, but here it's been all over media. So we have actively debated for decades and decades, the whole mining question, and there's a consensus to expand and diversify the economy, including by mining, tourism, other land-based businesses, and so forth. And it's true that fisheries continue to be the main export from Galashitinat, still making up something like 90%, 95% of the export. But there is a broad consensus, and that's also something that Greenland has signed memoranda of understanding with the US on, to expand cooperation, for example, with the US. The paradox is that we haven't really seen interest in investing, even though the door has been open, and that also goes towards the EU and other, friendly allies that might be out there who have had the opportunity for many years to engage and invest in Galashitinat in terms of mining potentials. We are quite an old mining nation. You might remember the cryolite that really had a significant role in the production of aluminum also for the US. And that mine was open for more than 100 years. Not a lot of income benefited Greenland. The cryolite that was mined during the war, when the US sort of kept the line of communication with Galashitinat while Denmark was occupied by the Germans, was simply taken to the US and used for production of aluminum to help production of airplanes, and thereby also significantly help the US and the Western Alliance in winning the war. That's one example, and we have many, many other examples of mines. The difference is now that we've taken over legislation on minerals since 2010, and all decisions on whether to mine or not are now exclusively with the Parliament of Greenland. And we've seen over the past years that there's more of a sort of willingness to do a more organic development around that, recognizing that being so few that we would rather take it a little bit slower and do more sustainable economies around new businesses, recognizing that mining will never be sustainable because you take out the mineral and it doesn't come back. And so having a lot of focus on how to do that responsibly, also in terms of workforce and influence of possible big, sort of immigration of workers from the outside to our communities. So there's, I would say, a very sort of responsible way of developing that here, but also choosing partners very carefully, knowing the great power rivalry and the effect and impact of that to our sort of room for maneuvering around what would be acceptable for our closest partners, which continue to be Denmark and the US.
Thank you. And I have kept, I let Dr. Olsvig know that I would let her go. So I've kept you long, and I apologize for that. But thank you very much for those questions. And I did keep all of you long as well. But I want to, first of all, thank Dr. Olsvig, thank my panelists, Marisol Maddox and Matt Druckenmiller as well. And thank all of you for being here. But thank you for all of your answers. And I will let you go. Dr. Olsvig, thank you. So I can't wait to see you again, and I appreciate your time, and I'll be in touch very soon. So thank you. And
have a good evening.
Good to see you, Sarah.
We'll be up here if you have any questions as well. Thank you.